Hello, and welcome to another episode of 18-Minute Experts, the podcast that dives into the minds of industry leaders in the wonderful world of group benefits. I'm your host, Michael Kettner, and in consideration of Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada, I'm joined by Leanne Flett, the National Vice President of Indigenous Practice for People Corporation. But before we jump into that conversation, just a quick reminder to our listeners, if you enjoy the content, please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform so that you can be notified of all upcoming episodes. You can also catch us at www.peoplecorporation.com/18min experts. If you're feeling ultra generous, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback guides us as we endeavor to provide the best possible group benefits focused content here in Canada. Now grab your headphones, turn up your speakers, and get ready for a thought-provoking dialogue with 18-Minute Experts. I have to say that when I saw this topic on our podcast planning schedule, I knew there was only one person I wanted to interview, and that was you, Leanne. I know we've had some just tremendous conversations in the past, and you've shared a number of books with me that I have subsequently read on the topic of the Indian Act and Truth and Reconciliation, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to our wider group benefits advisor audience here in Canada. But before we go too far on that topic, Leanne, why don't you introduce yourself and a little bit about your background and experience?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you in particular that you read those book recommendations. That's wonderful to hear that you're genuinely interested and gathering some knowledge. It's a good place to start reconciliation by understanding each other. Thank you, Lim. Why Haskell Halt Peace Naxil. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently in the Okanagan Nation territory in BC. I'm really grateful to be working and living on this land of the Syilx and Squamish people. I myself am Indigenous. I'm Cree Métis on my father's side and Scottish and Irish descent on my mother's side. And I'm married into the Okanagan Nation and raised my children here on the Penticton Indian Reserve in BC. So that's kind of how I ended up in the Okanagan Nation through marriage. And most of my career was actually spent in investment management for First Nations across Canada. I actually worked from coast to coast with different First Nations. I was working for one of Canada's largest pension management firms until I was invited to take the lead here of the National Indigenous Practice at People Corp.
So out of that career, was there a specific highlight where you're going, I was really proud of that moment?
Oh, thank you for that. There has been some significant highlights. When I first started my career, I remember when I was quite young, I read the Indian Act, which is an important piece of legislation to read. It's important to be aware of. And I always wanted to look at, in my career, how to do things that would be in best interest of Indigenous people and understanding our limitations because of the Indian Act and how to kind of push the boundaries on that. So I did open the first brokerage firm on reserve lands in Westbank First Nation in BC many years ago. And I think that was a big accomplishment. At that time, being one of the first female Indigenous stockbrokers and opening a brokerage firm on reserve lands. It had a deeper purpose. I was exploring tax exemption for my clients, and it's a long story, but I'll just leave it at that.
No, that's one thing I've admired about you, just breaking that ground, right? Female, Indigenous investment advisor. Like, it's the hope that you can inspire a ton more to follow. And I probably need to follow your lead, Leanne. I also need to acknowledge, and I did some research on it this morning as I was preparing for this podcast, that I am based from what I researched, that I am currently based in either the Matsqui Nation territory or the Sumas Nation territory. And so I'd want to acknowledge that as well. But diving into our warm-up question, just to get the dialogue going a little further, what have been some of your most influential books that you've read and why?
Well, I love books, and the list is long. That's a hard decision. I have some favorite Indigenous authors, Lee Maracle, who is no longer with us, but her books sure leave a legacy. Beautiful fiction books, nonfiction and history about Indigenous people by Indigenous people. There's a lot of books about Indigenous history that aren't written by us, and I don't recommend using that as your source of truth. If you want to know our history, a better place to look for in our own Indigenous authors, and there's a lot out there.
If there was one or two books that this is the one or two that you have to read.
Well, it's very timely because of Truth and Reconciliation, but there's some really important books about residential school. I actually worked in publishing prior to my long career. When I went to university, I actually took fine arts and creative writing, and then spent time afterwards working for an Indigenous publisher and worked on books about residential school. Very challenging for the survivors to tell their stories. It was a whole process on the approach for gathering the stories and then documenting them. But there are books out there that can provide awareness on what happened, and some of it's very shocking, of course, as people are becoming aware of more so these days. Just heartbreaking. Children as young as 3 years old being taken from their families. And so there's dozens, and I don't know how many out there, but a couple that I worked on, one was called The Circle Game. There was another one called Behind Closed Doors, and that was stories from the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is the one that really hit the media when the 215 children or graves were discovered. So that book is about that school in particular. We always knew amongst ourselves that school had a particularly bad reputation as being one of the worst, but I kind of look and I think, how can you measure the worst when you're even talking about this? I mean, anywhere where this took place was the worst. So sorry, I've gone off a bit on a tangent there.
No, I've read a little bit on it as well, and just horrifying stories. It is good to be aware of what happened. So let's jump into our topic. Let me pick your brain, Leanne. In a previous role here at People Corp, I talked with hundreds of advisors across Canada, and a lot of them expressed just absolute interest in supporting Indigenous communities and providing the best possible advice on group benefits. If an advisor was to come to you and ask what they need to know or understand so that they can build a better connection or show respect and consideration, what would you say?
Well, I'm really glad to hear that people are asking these questions. It's good to hear the way that you frame that they're interested in supporting Indigenous communities through providing accurate advice. I think that's great to hear, that interest is there. And I guess I would start with, prior to making connections, kind of like I think anybody would in the mainstream, learn about who you're going to be talking to, learn about your client. You and I both have just gone through the land acknowledgements, and yours was interesting because, you said it could be here, it could be here. You weren't 100% sure. So can I just do a bit of explaining for a minute? Because everybody's at a different place with their knowledge. So I'll just take the liberty to kind of explain briefly. We've mentioned Indigenous people. I myself am Indigenous. We're talking about some First Nations, and we've talked about the territory and the land acknowledgement. So just to clarify a bit more on that, the word Indigenous is used to represent the Indigenous people, which includes First Nations, Métis, Inuit. The older term is Aboriginal, which is used less often these days, but it's still out there in some of our texts and some government bodies. So you will still see the word Aboriginal there. When I was a kid, we were Native, and so that's more of a colloquial term that some people still use amongst themselves. But Indigenous would be the correct term. if you're talking about the general Indigenous population in Canada. First Nations is specific to, it goes back to colonization when we were separated from the rest of Canada and put onto reserves. And then we were registered and given a number, an Indian status number. And so those reserves are the First Nations. They're also called Indian bands. Again, Indian is an older word that I wouldn't recommend using. It's very problematic, but we do have to use it in the context, as we still have the Indian Act, we still have Indian bands. Some Indian bands are moving away from that language and renaming themselves as a First Nation, but there is still Indian reserves out there as well. And sorry, the reason I'm bringing this up is I'm thinking of your advisors going out to a potential community or prospect, and it might help to know what makes up a nation, a First Nation or an Indian band, and understanding what that territory is. And I'll use the Okanagan Nation because I'm here today in the Okanagan Nation territory. And it's actually made up of 7 bands. So 7 Indian bands are in the Okanagan Nation. From it actually crosses the border, the U.S. border, because we didn't have those borders in our history. Those borders were imposed after. So the 7 bands in the Okanagan Nation, I mentioned the Penticton Indian Band. There's the Osuyus Indian Band, Lower Similkameen, Okanagan. Sorry, I should have went through this before. I tried to list it off. I do know them all. Okanagan Indian Band, which is actually Vernon, and then West Bank First Nation. So you'll see there that West Bank has changed their name to West Bank First Nation instead of Indian Band. But how everyone is connected and why it's a nation is, it's rooted in that we all speak the same language. So they speak in Syilxin. And that really is what defines your territories, is it's people of the same nation are going to have the same, maybe not the same dialect in every case, because our languages have multiple dialects, but so that makes up the territory. So if you're going to meet a prospect, you might want to go and learn about them. Is it just the one Indian band, or are they part of a larger nation? There's a lot of variance across Canada. So that's why you might have come up, Michael, with 2 names there, and you weren't sure kind of where you fell on that line. And, they might be part of the same nation, and so there might be crossover there, or it might be that they're 2 distinct First Nations.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. This is really sales 101, right? Like it is truly understand your prospect.
Absolutely.
Go in with some knowledge. Mm-hmm. Do your research ahead of time, just like you would do for any other prospect that's worth pursuing. If you were to recommend, are there specific books or resources that you would go to as an advisor to learn more about this? Because there's only so much that we can cover in 18-minute experts.
Oh, absolutely. There's a ton of Indigenous awareness training programs that are available. I think that one of the book I recommended to you was Bob Joseph's 21 Things You Didn't Know About the
exactly
Indian Act.
The one.
Yeah, there's a whole Indigenous awareness faculty. There's a whole program that goes with that. If you Google Bob Joseph, there's a company that facilitates Indigenous awareness training. There's so many out there. I can think of Holly Fortier. Really, if you just look it up, because it's going to depend on your region, who you might want to bring in as a facilitator. There's people you can bring in and do cultural awareness training for your company, for your employees. There's tons online. There's usually around September 30th, there's a lot of free programs online you can drop into. I think University of Lethbridge had a course, or has a course, that is very comprehensive. Like you said, there's books, there's courses.
And it's also just having conversations, right? Like I went to, this is going to show where I am exactly, but I went to an Abbey Canucks game and had the fortune to sit beside a family, an Indigenous family, and they were more than happy to share, right? Like they were, like, we had a great conversation.
Wonderful.
Like having those conversations where you can is also valuable.
Absolutely. That's beautiful to hear. And you can do that as well as an advisor or as an employer. You can increase your diversity in your workforce by posting on Indigenous job websites and procuring Indigenous business. Anything you might need in your business. If you need a website, there's Indigenous designers. If you need office furniture, we have companies that do that. Coffee supply makers, there's anything you can outsource, you can likely find an Indigenous business to support you with that. And that will help you start those conversations. I mean, if you increase your Indigenous workforce, you're going to be surrounded by people who you can share your ideas with and learn more about each other. So for sure, having those conversations with people is fantastic.
So I want to bring this topic specifically to group benefits. I know there are government-funded programs that provide a base level of coverage. What benefits do Indigenous people currently have from government programs, and specifically on health and dental benefits?
For sure. We have something called non-insured health benefits. It's actually non-insured health benefits for First Nations and Inuit. And depending on people's level of knowledge, you'd have to understand who's eligible for that. So it would only be status Indian people or people who hold Indian status who are eligible for these benefits. NIHB it's national, except within British Columbia, they have a similar program, but it's First Nation Health Authority, FNHA. And they have some benefits there, again, just like your mainstream kind of carrier products. Not everything is going to qualify, so you'd have to coordinate the benefits, and there's certain ways to do that. I mean, we have experts here at People Corp and can provide more information on that if advisors want to reach out. But that's mainly the program. So the non-insured health benefits. I mean, if you look back at our treaties, this comes from way back in the 1800s. There was Chief Takakup in 1876 met with. This is a time when we were on reserve, and this gets a bit heavy, to tell you the truth, but most of our buffalo had been killed off, and there was starvation going on, and the chiefs were very scared for their people. We were restricted to reserves. We couldn't leave, and there was Indian agents on the reserves. There was also epidemic of disease. There was tuberculosis and smallpox. And the Indian agents who were on the reserve had access to medicine. There would be a doctor who would come around on horse and provide medicine. And Chief Atakakup saw this. And so he went back and asked for a revision in the treaty so that he could access for his people the medicine that was being provided to these white settlers. And so I think the treaty amendment said something to the effect of that a medicine chest shall be kept at the house of each Indian agent for the use and benefit of the Indians. And so this promise, this commitment was made back in the 1800s, and it's been amended many times, and it's not all encompassing, and it's not perfect, but it's good for your advisors to be aware of the fact that we do have non-insured health benefits or First Nation Health Authority benefits in Canada that we can use as well as our group benefits.
So I have a question then, just based on that. Are these benefits sufficient? Like why otherwise even offer a group benefit plan on top of it?
Well, they're not comprehensive, and no, they are not sufficient. So that's why, here at People Corp, we have 3 firms working with Indigenous clients across the country because they absolutely rely on added group benefit programs to support their employees. It's a bit of a complex story that involves legislation and things that I don't think we have time to get into a lot of it in an 18-minute conversation. But no, the non-insured health benefits are not sufficient, and therefore group benefits with Indigenous groups and First Nations across Canada is beneficial.
What are the particular strengths of the NIHB program, and what are the potential drawbacks from it?
Michael, this is such a big one.
Like I know as I asked that question, I've worked with some First Nation bands, and and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on what the perception I got, but there wasn't enough coverage.
No.
Like sometimes there was great coverage at the beginning of the year and then not great coverage at the end of the year because there was no more funding for that program. And so it was a mad dash to get the receipts in. And then they were so grateful to have a group benefit plan on top of it that, when the NIHB program didn't pay, they had a second payer there to pick it up and support their communities and support with coverages that their people needed.
Absolutely.
But was my perception wrong?
No, that's it. It's definitely not comprehensive support. There isn't enough funding. There's huge gaps and a lot of issues even around how it's administered. There's so many statistics I could bring into this conversation that would get bogged down. But if you look at our statistics in our health area and poverty, and you combine these things, and just even someone being able to get in to see a dentist with coverage that isn't complete, and then being required to have money up front before they can even make the appointment. When it's just the non-insured health benefits, sometimes people will go without. They'll go without glasses, or they'll go without dental because that non-insured health benefit won't get them the appointment or the service they need. And without the added group benefit plan, they can't afford it.
Yeah. And so I think that's the real value, right? For advisors, knowing that landscape, knowing that when they enter these communities, there is value that we can bring to the table as an advisor. There is support that we can provide to these communities. So Leanne,
yes,
with Truth and Reconciliation Day around the corner, what can advisors do to participate and support those communities?
Yes, September 30th is coming. It's such an important day to get out and support. And if you want to be an ally, come to these events, get to know each other, participate in what's available to you locally. I mean, it's made a big difference when we go out to march and we see you standing with us. It's made a big difference to see that exposure really hit home with Canadians. And after the Kamloops Indian Residential School graves were discovered, and it kind of really hit the news with the larger part of Canada, how many people came forward and stood by us, and that hasn't gone unnoticed. So we are happy and look forward to seeing you with us on September 30th.
Perfect. I look forward to being there as well.
Yay. Thank you.
Leanne, I appreciate you spending some time with us today. The dialogue has been extremely informative, and I hope this has been valuable to you as well.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And there you have it, folks. Another episode of 18-Minute Experts in the books. Remember, the insights shared here are just a small part of our mission to provide Canadian group benefit advisors with top-notch content so they can continue to provide amazing independent advice to their clients, prospects, and communities. To stay updated on future episodes, hit that subscribe button on YouTube or your favorite podcast provider. When it comes to navigating the complexities of group benefits, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay empowered. Until next time.